History doesn't just live in textbooks. Sometimes it gets written directly into your DNA. Here are 5 diseases that shaped human history and left permanent marks on the people who survived them. Between 1347 and 1351, the Black Death killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's population. But surviving it may have come with a hidden price, one that some descendants are still paying today. Researchers studying DNA from plague, victims and survivors found that certain immune-related gene variants, including one called ERAP1, became more common in European populations after the Black Death. These variants appear to have helped immune cells respond more effectively to the plague bacteria, giving carriers a real survival advantage during repeated waves of the disease. Scientists were able to test this by comparing DNA extracted from plague pits, mass graves from the 14th century, against DNA from people who died before the pandemic even began. The difference was striking. In just a few generations, natural selection had measurably reshaped the immune genes of an entire population, something that normally takes thousands of years to happen. But here's the twist. Those same protective variants are now linked to a higher risk of autoimmune conditions today, including Crohn's disease and rheumatoid arthritis. Essentially, the immune system adaptations that helped fight off a deadly bacterial infection may have also made that immune system slightly more likely to attack the body's own tissue centuries later. Scientists call this an evolutionary trade-off, a trait that's helpful in one context but harmful in another. It raises a bigger question, too. As modern medicine removes many of the survival pressures our ancestors faced, are we still evolving at all? Or did events like the Black Death permanently lock in traits we're stuck with regardless of whether we still need them? The Black Death didn't just reshape medieval society. For some of us, it's still quietly shaping our immune systems today. In 1918, a flu strain swept the globe and killed an estimated 50 million people, more than World War I itself. But here's the part most people don't know. If your great-grandmother was pregnant during that pandemic, it might still be affecting your family today. Researchers studying survivors born during the pandemic found something strange. Babies who were in the womb while their mothers were infected showed different long-term health patterns decades later, including higher rates of certain chronic conditions and, in some studies, shorter average lifespans compared to people born just before or after the outbreak. Scientists believe this happened through something called fetal programming, when a stressed or infected mother's body sends signals that permanently shape how a developing baby's organs and immune system grow. The timing of exposure during pregnancy seemed to matter a lot. Babies exposed during the earliest months of development, when major organs are still forming, tended to show more pronounced effects later in life than babies exposed later in pregnancy. This lines up with a broader pattern researchers have found across other historical famines and disasters. The earlier the disruption happens in development, the more far-reaching the consequences tend to be decades down the line. It wasn't just physical health either. Some research has linked in utero exposure during the 1918 pandemic to differences in later life outcomes like educational attainment and income, suggesting the effects of a virus can ripple through a person's entire life without them ever being infected themselves. So the flu didn't just kill in 1918. For some families, it quietly rewired the next generation before they were even born, which makes you wonder what invisible marks our current pandemics might be leaving behind and whether we'll even recognize them for what they are until decades from now. Between 1845 and 1852, Ireland lost roughly 1 million people to famine and related disease, and another 1 million fled the country entirely. But some scientists believe the famine may have left a mark that's still affecting descendants today, through metabolism itself. This connects to something called the thrifty gene hypothesis. The idea that populations who experienced repeated famine over generations may have evolved bodies that are extremely efficient at storing fat and energy, which would have been a survival advantage during starvation. The theory suggests that in today's world of constant food availability, those same efficient storage traits could contribute to higher rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes in descendant populations. Similar patterns have been studied in other, historically famine-affected populations around the world, which is part of why the thrifty gene idea gained so much traction in the first place. Researchers have looked at groups ranging from Pacific Islander populations to indigenous communities in North America, all with histories of food scarcity followed by rapid shifts to modern calorie-dense diets, and found comparable increases. In metabolic disease, it's important to say this hypothesis is genuinely debated among scientists. Some researchers argue the evidence is inconsistent or that modern diet and lifestyle explain these patterns better than genetics, and that it's difficult to isolate genetic effects from the compounding effects of poverty, healthcare access, and food environment. But it's a compelling example of how a historical trauma might not just live in a country's memory, but potentially in its biology. Whether or not the thrifty gene theory holds up to more research, one thing is clear. History doesn't just get written in textbooks. Sometimes it gets written into us. Smallpox killed an estimated 300 million people in the 20th century alone before it was eradicated. But for thousands of years before that, it was quietly doing something else, shaping the immune systems of everyone who survived it. For centuries, smallpox outbreaks acted like a brutal filter. People with certain immune gene variants were more likely to survive and pass those genes on. Over enough generations, this kind of repeated pressure can shift, which immune traits become common in a population, a process researchers call pathogen-driven selection. Scientists have studied genes like CCR5, which plays a role in how immune cells respond to viral threats, looking at how historical disease pressure may have influenced how common certain variants are today. Interestingly, some of the same genetic regions shaped by smallpox exposure also appear to interact with how the body responds to entirely different modern diseases, which is part of why researchers keep coming back to this virus even decades after it was wiped out. Studying old, eradicated diseases turns out to be one of the more useful ways to understand immune conditions people are diagnosed with right now. This isn't just ancient history trivia, it's part of why immune systems vary so much between people and populations. The diseases your ancestors survived may have left a permanent fingerprint on how your own immune system reacts to threats today, long after the disease itself is gone. Smallpox has been eradicated since 1980, but the genetic pressure it applied to humanity for thousands of years didn't disappear with it. It's still written into us in ways scientists are only beginning to fully map out. Tuberculosis has haunted humanity for thousands of years, and unlike smallpox, it never went away. Today, it still infects millions every year, but how your ancestors dealt with it might determine how vulnerable you are right now. Populations with centuries of long-term exposure to TB tend to show different immune responses compared to populations that encountered it more recently. This became tragically clear when TB was introduced to indigenous communities that had little prior exposure. The disease spread far faster and more severely than in populations with generations of prior adaptation. Long-term exposure appears to act like training data for the immune system, shaping how effectively it recognizes and fights the bacteria. Part of what makes TB such a difficult disease to study is that it can lie dormant in the body for years, or even decades before becoming active, which means the immune system's long-term relationship with the bacteria plays out over an entire lifetime rather than a single infection event. Researchers believe this extended exposure window is part of why population-level immune differences matter so much more with TB than with faster-moving diseases. This has real modern consequences. Researchers studying TB susceptibility today look at these historical exposure differences to understand why some populations face higher risk, which matters for how public health resources and vaccines get targeted around the world, and why a one-size-fits-all approach to TB prevention doesn't work equally well everywhere. TB is a reminder that our immune systems aren't just shaped by our own lifetime. They're shaped by every generation